here with us today.
Okay, it's being recorded.
Yeah.
Okay, you got it.
Can just in case double record it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Send me the
Send
request,
and then
and
you allow
I allow
yourself
it.
for recording.
So thank you, Bruno. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Victor. Well, first, thanks for having me here. Thanks, Victor, Bea, Anton, and everyone who received me really, really well here. I'm glad to hear that this is an experimental format because my presentation will also be a little bit experimental. So if things don't make sense, well, it's part of that is my fault because of course I don't make sense all the time, but also because I'm trying to talk about other things that I didn't have much chance to talk in other presentations or even in my teaching. So in some ways you're being my guinea pigs, my tests, my testers in that sense. So I wanted to, and as you see, of course, we are probably heading to a problem in the video games industry. And I'm sad to say, I don't present any practical solutions to that. I'm not going to sort out or to give a direction on what to do with your career, but at least there are some things here to think that might be relevant, and I'll be relying on my own experience before, both as academic and as a game developer in the past to try to elaborate my points. So let's see if this works. Yes, it's working. So if you want to, you know, just pretend that you are here, but think about, you know, your character and how you're going to beat the next, reach the next level in your favorite RPG. I'm going to give you the gist of what I want to make in terms of my main message. My first message is games are important because they are cultural forms, okay? What do I mean by that? Games are important because they are part of culture. You are game students. By now, you must have already thought and discussed that many, many times. The second point is the more different people know, talk about, and make games, the better. That might sound counterintuitive, especially if you're thinking, you know, thinking about what I just said, right? If the industry is shrinking, I don't want more competition, right? What I will try to convince you with this presentation is that having more people making games is not necessarily a bad thing, even if you're looking from a commercial only standpoint. So in this presentation, I'm going to go back and forth with my own thoughts. Okay, so this is a quote. I promise my slides don't look all like that. Okay, you're not going to, I don't want to make you fall asleep. But this is just to give a context. I'll get more into that in a second. I did in some ways the opposite of your trajectory because I started in the games industry and then I became an academic. Then I started to study games in the university. So this is probably one of the main texts when I was doing that transition that made everything click for me and made me decide on why I want to explore these things that I'm talking about today. And it is from Ian Bogost, one author. I can see some smiles because, you know, we can say that he's quite problematic, especially in his last works. But I found this, you know, as someone who was working at the time and thinking about games and thinking about the environment around me, making games quite appealing because the main point is about games becoming mainstream, right? So games ceasing to be niche work, okay? So ceasing to be like nobody, of course we have, if you think about cinema, we have, you know, cinephiles who would be in English, like people who are really into a particular type of cinema. But nobody, it's not even a conversation if you like movies or not. You just watch movies, right? So that's more or less how I read this. Okay, so this is where I at least think we should be aiming at in terms of gaming, right? It shouldn't be a discussion whether you like games or not. It should be a discussion of what kinds of game you like, what kinds of game you play. And this is what I think permeates everything that I have done from that time on. So to make this argument, I'll try to connect two main ideas. First, we're going to think about the idea of games industry, okay, and problematize the idea of the games industry. And second, I'm going to talk a little bit about my work that Victor already introduced a little bit on literacy, cultural forms, and participation. So think about industry, okay, and think about industry in the singular and the idea of industry experience. As Victor already said, between 2009 and 2012, when I was in Brazil, I worked at Tectoy. It's good to know that Victor also introduced Tectoy a little bit, but Tectoy is a company that still exists in Brazil. That's part of the work that Victor and I are currently developing, and hopefully you'll have the chance to read more about it in the near future. But Tectoy started as a partnership as a toy company in the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, and they started a partnership with Sega and continued as such. As you know, because you studied history of games, right? Sega ceased to make hardware at some point after Dreamcast, but Tectoy kept going. And at this time, 2009, what kind of games, what kind of hardware Sega was producing? Nothing, right? So Tectoy was still selling Mega Drives, and we're still making games for Mega Drive. So this is a particular version of Mega Drive that just exists in Brazil, following on Guitar Hero. So you have a Guitar Hero version for Mega Drive called Guitar Idol. Very, very nice game to play. Not as good as the original thing. We used to do a lot of portings, okay? So mobile games before the smartphone era, in that sense. So lots of portings and localization. And we worked with the console Cibo that I won't be talking about. Funny thing, that's a picture of part of the team. You can see that there's a gap here. This is where I should be. I was on internet at that time, and I missed the photo that day because I was doing a test at the university, a test for my Spanish class. You can see that, it didn't work that well. That's why I'm doing this talk in English now. Now, my question for you is this kind of experience, like, imagine that I am applying for a job right now, okay? And of course, as you might have seen already in terms of jobs, most of the jobs already ask for industry experience. Is this kind of experience relevant for applying for a job now in a big company here or in the US?
Should be. So at least it should be.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think any company would value it, but I think it should be.
Why you think they wouldn't value it?
Time, it's updated. Nobody will care if you have
Mm-hmm.
experience in the console that was sold, what, 20 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Who cares?
So, very good. So there's a problem of time. And?
But in the same time, you are doing ports from existing console to other mobile or technology. So you think you could count I know how to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I guess so. It is relevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, and your answers were really great and much better than what I expected. Because why am I talking about this? So when I applied for my current job at UCL, they asked for industry experience. And they told my experience wasn't valid because this is not industry level thing. Now, why wasn't this considered industry level? Because this was, making games for a console from the 90s, from the, making games for a console that no one ever heard about, making portings for things that don't exist anymore. And most specifically, these games couldn't be verified from an English standpoint because everything was in Portuguese, everything was made in Brazil, and so on. So this is where I wanted to start thinking about the whole idea of industry. And of course, problematizing the idea of games industry. I'm going to rely a lot on Brennan Keel's work to make this point. But of course, if you think about the idea of games industry in the singular, the problem is, and that's a thing that we all do, right? I have done that many times to try to justify why I work with games academically and non-academically, talking about the size of the industry, like look how many money games move. Now, the problem is all those things, they are concentrated in a very small space. We're talking about a very small and particular case, right? So, and of course, we can talk about the geopolitics of that. We can talk about, China moving in, Microsoft buying Activision, but that's a very particular space that doesn't cover most of video game production. And that's the point where I think it's interesting to think about. We like to think about us, and despite being an academic now, I would say I'm more an academic than anything. I still consider myself as a video game maker in some ways. I still dabble with some things. We like to think about us most of the time as, tech workers in some cases. We might think about us as artists, working in big spaces and so on. However, following, I think that a better and more productive way of thinking about that would be to think about us as cultural workers, as Brennan Keel is going to argue. So instead of looking, for example, to software development, we should be looking, for example, at how musicians work or actors or so on, because we have a big question of how you become a game worker and how you have to work to make yourself visible and so on. And that, of course, is also more, it's more honest from our part to think about game production and to think about working with games on the same way, right? Most of the people who study music, they don't do that because they want to become Bad Bunny, for example, right? They do that because maybe they like playing music, maybe they think it's a way of expressing yourself. And of course, for every Bad Bunny that you have thousands and thousands of buskers going around trying to make a living. You can think about that in terms of games as well, right? So for every Miyamoto that you can have thousands and thousands of people making very simple, crappy games that will see some attention locally, maybe, but will never break. So that's why we should think about industries in different spaces and ways. I'm going to get a little bit into history to that, and you can see that I'm basically taking Brennan Keel's work here and replicating it, but there's a reason why, okay? Because I will use that to explain my transition into what I am doing now. Okay, so if we look, if you remember, I mentioned that I started working with games in the late 2000s, and it was exactly when, if you look at literature, video games industries were going into a transition phase. Okay, and there are two phases here. Of course, we can discuss that this looks mostly at mainstream spaces. It doesn't look at Brazil, but it still kind of works in some ways. And that's these two spaces are periods of so-called aggressive formalization. So from what we be from the 80s until 2000s, and intense informalization from 2010s to where we are still right now. So aggressive formalization, it's the idea that it's when, before that we had a mix, it's very good to be talking about this because yesterday I was sitting on Victor's class and it was about the Spanish history of games. And it captures quite well this time and also the time before that. So before that, it's kind of a free-for-all, right? And it is probably around the 90s, more specifically, that you get this idea of separating who are the proper game makers and who are the hobbyists. Okay, so if you are not the hobbits, the hobbyists. So if you are a prop game developer, you are going to do that commercially in the industry. If you are not doing that, you are just someone dabbling with things, just a hobbyist, and so on. If you don't take anything, do you recognize this steel frame?
But the guy on the left seems from what's it called? System of Dawn. I don't think it's
no, it isn't. No, so this is still from, if you at the end of this session, you think this is crap, this guy doesn't know anything. One thing that you can take is, this is still from a TV show called Mythic Quest. I don't know if you watched it. This is specifically from season 1, episode 5, which is a standalone episode. So you can watch it by itself if you'd like. And although it's heavily fictionalized, I think it's interesting because Mythic Quest, if you don't know what it's about, it's a TV show that it's a workplace comedy about a a games studio. So, quite related. But this is a standalone episode about forming a studio and making games during the 90s. So it's heavily fictionalized. Of course, it's Hollywood looking at that, but it's interesting to see how these things happen. And it's in this time that we have two main issues connected to the previous point that I made from me and Bogost. Okay, so one of the things is at this time that you have the idea of working with games as a passion. Okay, it's going to be around this time that you have the EA spouse case, if you know that, but if you don't know, you can Google about it later. But it is about when crunching becomes the norm in some ways. And it's also in this time that we have the doubling down into a imagined audience. Okay, so basically thinking about games as product for young males in some ways. Now, intense informalization, the era where we are now. So it's the idea of expansion of markets and emergence of new business models. So we have mobile. Before, we're thinking about, it's either, we have a little bit of arcades, but it's either console or PCs, right? Now we have mobile, free to play, different models of selling things. With that, we also have platformization going on and the indie promise, right? So we can become indie. We don't depend anymore on publishers, on a big company. And also it's the time when we have engines becoming more and more popular, right? So the idea that you and 4 other people can make a game and, become rich. And we still have the idea of working with games with passion, but now you organize your own crunching, right? You don't need someone telling you to crunch because you know that you want to do it. Now, to think about that, we have to think about material conditions, right? And now I'm going to look at my own case, okay? So if you remember 2009, 2012, I was working in the industry. In some way, great part of the work that we did at Tectoy was for abroad, okay? So just to give a little bit of context, it was a stable company for us, despite the problem with Zibo. We had a lot of control on the Latin American market for mobile games. But if you think about the timing, that was around 2009, 10. What did happen in mobile gaming at that time? Remember, we're thinking about Brazil, right? So things take some time to get there. We started getting smartphones, right? The games that we were making were for Java, for feature phones. With smartphones, like, who are going to buy Java games if they can just go to Google Play or Apple Store, right? So there's a problem there. At the same time, Zibo was crashing and burning. So the work was becoming a slog, okay? So we're being pushed more and more far from games and making generic apps and other things that were not games. So what, at that time, we are in the transition, right? So we have company stable work here, but also we have the idea of, you know, we have Unity now. Maybe we can try and become indies. And that's where one of the things that I wanted to talk about, which are game jams, can be kind of a Trojan horse for us. This is a particular case. So has anyone here played Celeste? Yes? Okay. So a little bit of story. I know that I'm going very, very slow, but I think the story part is interesting. So what happened was one of my friends was really good friends with the guys who did the art for Celeste. And he was also an artist, and he was invited to do a game jam with them. And he came back at the studio. Remember, we're making apps, so it's work scrap, right? Said, wow, I just went to a game jam and we made a game in, 24 hours, and it was the best. And the game is here and you can play and it's amazing. Why don't we do that? And we try to measure ourselves and see how we go. So we signed up for a competitive jam. And these are photos from it. You can see that it's a very stereotypical game jam. This is 2012, right? But you can see, if you look at the photos, 90%, if you can find someone who is not a male here, good luck. You have a very good view. Loads of sponsored by Red Bull, of course. So people very high on, energetic and so on, energy drinks. And the thing was, it was great because we did this game and we won the game jam. It was a competitive game jam. So I said, wow, we really can make something out of this, right? You get that kind of rush. You get that kind of, this is easy work. You can see that I am in the picture now, okay? So this is us getting onto the stage. You can see me here. So I'm not lying. Even better. So we of course, it took us a long time to polish the game a little bit, but we just, you know what? Let's just throw it on Google Play and see what happens. A few months later, we got this email from someone from Google saying, hey, it's very difficult to read here, but saying, hey, I was browsing on Google Play. I found this game. It's really cool. Is it okay if we make it featured for the whole of Latin America? Like, of course, we died a little bit, but then I said, well, we're done. This is what we're going to do. this is our life now. Now the problem is, game jams, they can give you that rush and they can make that promise. But of course, as you might know, if you don't know, I'm telling you right now, winning a game jam or having that kind of small success is not the same as shipping a game, and even more, making that viable for a long time. Of course, we're thinking about problems like making a jam. In a jam, you are usually working in a very small time scale with very small prototype. But then making a finalized product, it's a whole different beast, right? It's much more difficult. There's many more things to think about. Of course, if you are used to game jams as well, besides, the whole issue that game jams have in, glorifying crunch, making, you feel that you can do it and you can keep working 48 hours straight without sleeping for a long amount of time. It also creates this mindset where you just jump from project to project to project, right? So you get to that stage where you simply want to jump into the next ship rather than finishing and shipping what you have. Now, of course, it didn't work that well for us, right? Because in that process, we realized there were many issues with our game. We managed to stay featured on Google Play for 2 weeks because we realized there was an issue with the way we were doing things with the new Nexus that, Google had just released, and we never managed to do that, never managed to work it out. So it was that kind of rush and then just full-on crashing and burning. So the thing is, on that is, my point here, and it's more to work as a cautionary tale, is making games is hard. No matter where you are, what conditions you have, if you're in a company or not, that's always hard. Now, the problem is, depending on where you are, it might be even harder because you might not have all the possible avenues. At that time, when we're still trying to figure out, let's try to make this work. Of course, we didn't have our stable jobs anymore. So what, how are you going to survive? Like, you are in Brazil, there are not many game companies that you can just go and find a job, right? We decided to have a chat with our friends from Celeste and with other developers that they knew abroad. And the answer we got was, we're just trying to browse ideas, to brainstorm ideas. And the suggestion we got from someone, was not from Brazil, was, why don't you do like I do? When I need money, I just knock on Cartoon Network's door. And I just say, hey, don't you need a game for, I don't know, for Adventure Time, like a browser game? Then I just get a shitload of money. And I, spend 3 months working on my own project. And then when I need that again, I'll just do the same thing. Now, that's fine if you know the way. If you are not in Brazil, if you are not, someone who is just trying to break into the industry. So what I'm trying to say is there are always different models here, and the local where you are in, it is quite important. So instead of trying to replicate the same model from every place, it is important to try to understand the context where you are in and what are the ways. Like, not every, if we are doing the analogies with music again, probably you can be the last case, just being a guy or a band playing on the streets and grabbing coins. But not every band will have a scene with stadiums that they will be able to fill anywhere in the world, right? It's the same thing for us, game makers, in that sense, from a more professional way. It depends. You need to understand the context where you are in and how you move across these contexts. Now, are game jams all bad? I would say they are bad, but not everything, okay? Because there's one thing that's good from game jams, which is they are open, okay? So they are open in the sense they tend to be receptive, and they tend to allow different people to come in and make different types of games. And there is a question of experimentation as well that game jams lend for, that's very relevant. Of course, we can think about examples of games that started as game jam games and became successful. But remember, for every surgeon simulator that you have, how many games produced in global game jam you have? So of course there is a thing to bear in mind here in relation to how game jams and the experimentation and becoming a hit. Again, another case for you to think about in the music metaphor, right? Now I want to pick a little bit on the experimentation, because that will connect to my second main point, which is about literacy. I will try to be a little bit quicker because literacy is something that doesn't interest everyone, but I think it's still relevant. And again, think about the idea of games as part of culture and the idea of diversity, right? Which is again another argument that you might have been made many times by many different people. So, as I said before, one of the key goals and the key drivers was the idea of having more people playing, talking about, and hopefully making games, right? So gaming becoming mainstream in that sense. I am thinking about that not in a tokenistic view, right? So I'm thinking about that in a proper way of making games mainstream and allowing for different people to coexist. I'm not thinking about that in the sense of, look, we're just, I don't know, we'll just have Black developers now, for example. Of course, that's great, but that's not necessarily, that's one of the ways of doing that. But of course, that's not necessarily the key goal. And again, this is not about increasing the competition, right? This is not about looking at games in terms of the indie apocalypse. Are you familiar with this term? Yeah, so it was something that was quite popular around that time, like 17, 18, which was the idea that, people should stop making games. There are too many games. It's impossible for us independent developers to survive. Well, if you go into Steam now, it's kind of that, right? In some ways, but it's not. I think the key point is it's not. Of course, there are a lot of games being produced and a lot of rubbish being produced, but it is about challenging what in the literature you'll find as the cultural bottleneck, okay? If you think about the amount of games that you have on Steam, for example, of course you have lots of crap, and of course you have lots of games, but how many of those games are just, the reproduction of medieval fantasy, European medieval fantasy tropes, for example? How many of the games that you see at Apple Store, for example, are copies of Bejeweled or Candy Crush? So it's about challenging. It's about having more people making games, which in some ways will lead to different types of games being made. And more important, as I will try to make the point, is having more people wanting to play different types of games, demanding different types of games to be played. Then I enter in the idea of game literacy, which in Spanish, literacy I'm using here as what would be alfabetización, okay? So it's not about using games to teach something. It's not about using games to teach maths or English or whatever. And it's not about gamifying learning. Game literacy, it is about how we develop skills on different people, on how to play games, how to discuss games, how to talk about games, how to connect games to politics, culture, society, and in some ways, how to make games as well. Like to understand what games are about. Like how do you make a game? Do you start from a story? Do you start from a mechanic? You know all about that, right? So I don't need to spend much time. You can see here, I don't have my, you can see that as well. I was just, side note, okay? I just sprained my wrist last week. And that's me doing one of my workshops with the kids. And I had sprained my wrist there as well. So yeah, just something that, it seems that every time that I talk about game literacy for different people, I sprain my wrist. So I don't know what's going on. So I'll be talking very quickly about my project, and this is more my academic work in terms of research that I have done before. Now I work more on teaching on masters, as Victor said, but this is about my work with young people in London. And in that, so what I did was I organized different workshops around London in schools and in community centers as well, to see how they dealt with the idea of making games by themselves, okay? So instead of me making a game to teach them something, they were developing the game, I was helping them to develop a game, and then we would be talking about different things, okay? So we would be talking about how they see the world, how they, I don't know, what was their relationship with their parents, the kinds of things they like doing, stories that they liked, and so on. So my focus was mostly on what I call cultural creative aspects. So ideas about writing, what are going to be the characters of your game, a little bit of game mechanics there, like, you know, like what can you do in the game? Why can't you do that? So on, and a little bit of audio production as well. To do that, important part, I couldn't leave my developer side. So I was using a particular software that was developed by me and other colleagues at UCL called Mission Maker. Don't look at it, it's crap. Maybe we need to cut that part. Yeah, but it's but one of the good things from Mission Maker, it is that it allowed kids to make 3D games very quickly and very easy. Okay, so I'm talking about kids like very young. So those kids that I showed in the picture, they were around 10. The kids I'm talking here, they are between 12 and 15. Here, just an example of, you know, the kind of activity that we do. So we start with the storyboard where the characters, and then we unpick, and then we move on to the software, paper prototyping, different things. And we worked with a slow jam model here, which was quite interesting because then we kind of had this kind of intense work from game jams, but separated in time. Okay, so in a week by week case, so around 6 weeks, 1.5 hours per day. Now, think about the games, 2 games that I liked very much of analyzing. I quoted myself, you know, I think every academic will do that. So, but I just put the reference there because, you know, if you are interested, maybe not, but if you are, you can read more about it later. So 2 different types of games that were produced. The first one was made by 2 girls who, by the way, are Spanish of Latin American descent. So they were born here, they are from Latin America, and they were living in London at the time. Who didn't play many games. And below we have another game produced by 2 boys who played a lot of games. Now, what's interesting here to think about, and what I was interested was how they saw what they had in the software and how they used that in order to appropriate the software and to make that their own, and how that allowed me to understand what they understood what a game was, and how I could use that to make them understand more about different types of games. Noob Assassin, it's quite interesting because even though the boys that made this game, they played a lot, at some point they realized they weren't interested in making games. So they just started, how can I break this software in many times? They were the perfect testers in that sense. So if you try to play their game, it doesn't make any sense unless you talk to them and then they explain to you what they were trying to do. So they were just playing around with physics. They realized that some of the colliders weren't very well designed. So if you combine 2 objects together, everything would explode. They were very interested in that kind of playful experience with a game-making platform. The girls, on the other hand, they were more interested in telling a story, and it was interesting also to see the ways their different perspectives were there. They were very into pop culture, Korean pop culture specifically. And what I found interesting and useful for us as game makers as well was this idea of the challenge of conventions from someone who comes with an outsider perspective, right? These girls specifically, so this is just a passage from a dialogue that I was having with them. So they had a game where the main action they wanted to do in a particular sequence was to take care of a character. Okay, so you were playing as a woman and you had just rescued your potential boyfriend, but he wasn't well. But they wanted a sequence to take care of them. And the thing was, like, they didn't know exactly how to articulate that through the game. And all the ideas I had were based on my own gaming experience, right? So of course, I thought about things like, how do you show care in other games, like Stardew Valley, for example? Just give things for them, right? But they didn't want that. They wanted to show a different type of care in that case, which wasn't necessarily linked to a material thing, right? They wanted to show that. So how do you reproduce that in a game, for example? And that was a question that, of course, I couldn't answer. Luckily, by the end, they just decided to do a different ending. So this sequence was scrapped. But it was interesting to think about how we often, as game makers, we rely on things that we know and on conventions, right? So if you think about, this is Mission Maker, by the way. So you can see it feels very mid-2000s graphics. Lots of medieval stuff for different reasons. So it feels very conventional in that sense, right? So it feels very, I want to be Skyrim, but I am not. And the problem is here, we tend to focus too much on replicating stuff several times, right? So if you think about, when we're working with engines, think about how easy it is to make, FPS in Unity, right? You can probably make that in, I don't know, half an hour. It won't be great, but it will work. But if you try to make, depending on the kind of game that you're trying to make, it can be very difficult, and it can be and thinking with the tool that you have at hand. It's something that can be quite important, and how to break this cycle. Oh, it seems that I'm late for the talk. You can see that, but my calendar just said, "Oh, you have a talk at Techno Campus in 5 minutes." So my key point here, and this is my last slide finally. Yes, you can breathe. Is to think about the activities and this kind of development of game literacy as a cultivation, and a cultivation of an audience. Okay, I'm sure that the work that was done with these girls, for example, and the efforts that they made to think about how to make a game, of course, what they learned in terms of how to make a game, but also the effort that they had to how can I represent that into a game, and the effort that I had in that dialogue, how can I help them to understand. It changed their relationship with games. And of course, that change is where I want to finish about, and where I want to talk. It is to think about us game makers as cultural workers, not only in the sense that Brendan Keogh talks about as musicians, but also cultural workers in the sense that Paulo Freire, an educator, will talk about, in the sense that we are cultural workers because our audiences, our players, they are learning more about culture, and we are teaching them stuff. Even if we don't want, we are teaching them stuff. And in that sense, it's our job, in some ways, our responsibility to cultivate different audiences, right? So we don't want, going back to my first slide, we don't want a monoculture, or at least I don't want. I don't know what you guys want. I don't want a monoculture where, it's like what's the Brazilian Amazon is like now. Everything is soy fields and nothing more. In that sense, it's important to think about us in terms of cultural workers on the kinds of games that we do and how we challenge these conventions in building in new audiences, right? In making people feel that they can be part of gaming, in proposing different ways of looking at games and making different types of games that can bring in different people into the field. I hope this made some sense. Well, if anything, at least you have a tip on a TV show to watch, right? And this is where I stop. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.